morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
How's everybody doing?
Glad it's Friday.
It does actually feel like it has meaning again now. Over the summer and during quarantine, it just didn't. I was like, what does
No, I felt the same way. Like now it's like, oh, weekends mean something, you know.
All right. So I think other people will probably roll in, but I'll start chatting at least. So just a reminder, we have more discussion days than usual in the next week or so. And that's because I think it's really important and interesting to discuss psychodynamic and psychoanalytic ideas in more detail. So we have one Monday. You only have one reading for that. There's a reading that Freud actually wrote. So we'll do a activity around that and have a class discussion. And then we'll spend next Wednesday talking about the post-Freudians. We'll probably do a little more of that on Friday, but then we'll have 2 days of sort of post-Freudian and modern reactions to Freud. Plenty of time to get through that material. So for Monday, make sure you've read the Freud reading in the Pieces book and come ready to discuss. It's always interesting, I think, to read these people in their own words, but know that some of the language, you know, it's from over 100 years ago now. So some of the language will, you know, not be the way we speak or write today. So. All righty. So today, we only have a few slides to go over, but I do have some videos for you. So actually, I think I'm going to start with one of those. So I have a video of archival footage of Freud himself, and it's being narrated by his daughter, Anna, who we'll talk about next Wednesday. So I thought that this was really interesting to see. So I'm going to go ahead and screen share and make sure I'm sharing my sound with y'all. Alrighty, so this is footage of Freud narrated by his daughter.
My father is here with a very old friend of his who already went to school with him in Vienna. He later became an archaeologist, professor of archaeology in Rome. He used to come to Vienna once a year in the autumn and then inspected the new additions to my father's antique collection, and they stayed great friends all their lives. He was especially nice, lovable man. In this picture, neither of these two men knew that they were photographed. And that is why the whole thing is so natural. My father didn't like to be photographed and usually made a face when he noticed it. But here he didn't know. I think this is really the best picture of the whole movie.
Let's just skip ahead. Oh, it's gonna change. Here we go. Here's him with
Again.
his dog.
My father and Yofi. She was a beautiful chow, very affectionate, very lovable. My mother on the left and her sister, Minna Bernays.
So when it exists, I think that it's important to actually see what these people look like, right? And see how they acted. And there is some footage of Freud talking, like some radio footage, but the sound quality is really bad. And he's basically saying stuff you all already know because you've done the reading and we've talked about it. So, but if you're really interested to hear what he sounded like, you can just YouTube like archival footage of Freud. There are several different videos. So I'm going to go ahead and get the PowerPoint rolling. Like I said, we only have a few slides, and I'll be kind of alternating back and forth today between the PowerPoint and some videos to show you what psychoanalysis is like, because I think that that's also really important to see, you know, what was this revolutionary therapy. So go ahead and share this. And because I'm going to bounce back and forth, I'm just going to sit today. So I'll try to project more than I usually do when I'm sitting. So psychoanalysis was this therapeutic technique that he came up with to help people who were having personality issues, right? People who were fixated, people who were experiencing neurosis, hysteria, all these things that we've talked about in passing. He largely treated adults, and like I mentioned, I think on Wednesday, he primarily taught middle class and upper middle class and upper class women who were experiencing hysteria and other neuroses. So first and foremost, psychoanalysis is a therapeutic technique. It was developed especially to help individuals with hysteria, but applied to pretty much any problem anyone came in with. And it used observation, analysis, and interpretation, as well as insight, and working through the problem with the patient. It was a new way of thinking about the mind, as well as just being a therapeutic technique. It was really an intellectual movement in a lot of ways. So Freud founded a psychoanalytic society, and they would have conversations about how and why this worked and how and why you can help patients. They really talked about the importance of these unconscious mental forces that we've been talking about. They talked about the importance of childhood. Up until that point, people had just sort of ignored childhood, or not really put a lot of emphasis on it. If you look at medieval paintings of like Mary with the Christ child, typically the children were just painted as small adults, even when they were supposed to be babies, right? We just like didn't realize the importance of childhood. The role of society in madness and health. So Freud recognized that a repressive society will breed repression and other problematic defense mechanisms in the individuals in that society. And it was also the idea of therapy as an intellectual quest. So searching for knowledge as well as healing. So Freud thought that not only could psychoanalysis make you sort of lose the symptoms of what whatever disorder you were experiencing, but it could also just sort of make you a better person. So the key feature of psychoanalysis was that, psychoanalysis was set up so the psychoanalyst sort of becomes the focus of your problems. And so that is why, and these pictures are actually, I took them, so they're not the best like composition, apologies. But these are actually from the house Freud lived in London. So if you go to his house in Vienna, none of his original stuff is there because he took it all with him when he had to flee the Nazis. And so it's all in this home in London. So this was Freud's office here. And you can see his desk in proximity to the chair where clients sat or laid, maybe the case here, the couch. So Freud would sit in this green chair with the red cushion tucked behind this other couch, and the client would repose on this couch. And the idea was the analyst would sit behind the client so that they would be sort of a blank screen for the client to project everything onto. Now, really interesting to just sort of like think about Freud as a person, right? And think about how he decorated, everything's in very like elaborate tapestries. As you can see, he was a collector of antiquities. This is his desk. This is where he did his writing. And he just had all these little figures all staring at him, basically. Like all of us that were on this trip were like, well, I don't know if I could work like that. But, it was inspirational for him. And I didn't include any of the pictures of the rest of the office, but he actually just sort of behind where I was standing when I took this picture, there were just shelves and shelves of other antiquities. So he was a huge collector. But yeah, this is the couch, and it sounds odd for someone who is certainly not a psychoanalyst, certainly doesn't endorse this type of therapy, but I almost felt like I was on hallowed ground when I stood in this room. I was just like, this is where talk therapy started. If Freud hadn't done this, would we have talk therapy today? Would it be as advanced as it is today? So as a clinical psychologist, it was sort of a moving experience for me, and made me more affectionate towards Freud, with limits. So different techniques that he used in psychoanalysis. One is transference. So this is that information uncovered in therapy is projected onto the doctor. And this can, in theory, become problematic if they start to see the doctor as like a father figure or, a sexual partner, right? So this is often something you have to like process and work through. Countertransference is when the therapist has feelings that are projected back on the client. And this is something that even in modern therapy, we are very aware of and try to sort of hold in check with ourselves and process with colleagues if we're struggling with countertransference. So sometimes it could just be the client feels like they're rubbing you the wrong way. You're annoyed when you're in session with them. And so then you need to sit back and realize, like, why am I feeling this way? How can I get over it so I can be beneficial to the client, right? Or is it insurmountable and I should transfer this person, right? So I remember I had a client when I was at the VA that was just, when she spoke about certain things, I would just feel myself getting sort of like tense and almost annoyed, which I never really experienced with a client previously. So I talked with my supervisor about it, and I ended up finding a way to like very tactfully say to her, like, I experience this sometimes when you're talking. Is that something anyone else has ever shared with you? And she said, yeah, lots of people say that. And so she and I were able to have like a really productive conversation about what was it about the way she presented herself that brought that out in people. And so that was really helpful to her and starting to look at how she related to people and make that healthier. So countertransference can be like a really effective technique. Yeah, did someone have a question? Okay. Awesome. So it can also be problematic, right? So if as a psychologist, your countertransference is sexual in nature, right? Or you just can't stand this client, right? You think they're a horrible person or some such, it's going to be really hard for you to help them, right? And so again, here's where you might need to seek some counsel, get some advice from a colleague. And again, if you just can't find a way that you can be helpful to other people, then perhaps you need to transfer that person, because it's not ethical to keep treating someone that you just can't help, right? Because you really don't like them. It can also just be awkward, right? Depending on the therapist's ability to deal with it. So I had a supervisor while I was on residency, and he was co-teaching a seminar for us about sort of client issues, therapy issues, process issues. And he was talking about a client who said that, like, oh, I just have, sex with guys the first time I meet them. So he said, well, let's see, it's been about 4 months since we've been seeing each other, so we should have sex. And he was using it in like a humorous way, right? But it's still like a really inappropriate thing to say. And like the funniest thing to me about when he said this in our seminar was to see the female psychologist who was co-leading with him. And she just went, and she said, what would you have done if she said yes? And he was like, oh, I knew she wasn't going to, right? But clearly, you don't have to be a Freudian to know that that probably is something inside of him that's also coming out, right? And so you need to like analyze those things in yourself and make sure you're not being inappropriate with your clients. And for this reason, if you were going to be a psychotherapist, a psychoanalyst in particular, the belief was that you were supposed to undergo your own psychoanalysis before you started therapy, so that you could work out your own issues and you wouldn't negatively affect your clients.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I did almost 2 years of psychology in year Y, and it's really focused on psychoanalysis, mostly psychoanalysis and social psychology. Those are the main focuses there. And basically every therapist has to undergo their own therapy, and they have to show proof that they do before they get their degree. And they have to keep doing that along their career. That's a really important thing that you have to do in order to, work as a psychotherapist, especially if you're doing clinical work.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because different schools of thought are different about that, right? So psychoanalysis, yes, you have to have a therapist and you have to work through these issues so that you don't put them on your clients. I'm trained in the cognitive behavioral method, and it wasn't like, they didn't bar you from going to therapy, but they certainly didn't require it. And if you felt like you needed therapy, it was something that was like more hush-hush rather than something that was required by the program, which is weird, right, for therapists who know that therapy can help anybody. But that's just sort of how it was. Yeah, actually, Romina, what you said made me think of, there's actually a really good show that was on HBO several years back called In Treatment. And it was real time. So there were like 5 episodes a week, and each was therapy with a different client, but his Friday session was always with his therapist. So that, kind of showed that. So I personally think it's a good thing if you're a therapist, especially if you're struggling, to either get supervision or maybe your own therapy. But like I said, there are some techniques that just don't make it as obvious. So thanks for sharing that. Yeah, and there are some grad programs, exactly like Romina said, that require you to go through therapy, which, again, as long as it's not they're pairing you with someone you can't work with therapeutically, right? It's probably a healthy thing. So, really good point. So, Freud started this therapy, right? So at first he was the only one who could psychoanalyze other people, and he claimed he psychoanalyzed himself, and it was cool. So you can kind of like take that however you take it, right? But that means that his daughter, Anna, who we heard speaking in the clip earlier, had to be psychoanalyzed by her dad. So like imagine talking about like the electric complex, or as Freud called it then, the Oedipal complex, you know, with your dad. Very strange. They made it work, right? And in fact, Anna lived with him until he passed away, and then continued living in this London home, I think for like another 20 years. So, you know, again, they made it work. Some of us might think that we couldn't quite do that with our dads, right? Then there's free association. And this is a big chunk of psychoanalysis. So this is just sitting and kind of saying whatever comes to mind. And this was thought to be a way to get at the unconscious. That if you just talked enough, your therapist would start to see patterns, things would emerge that you wouldn't just bring up if you had, you know, a one sentence thing. So the main goal of the therapist in this is interpretation. So they have to offer interpretations to clients of, you know, their free association, their transference. The next slide, we're going to talk about dreams. So all of those things. So the therapist tried to recognize conflicts, help patients discover compromises, and essentially find ways to navigate sort of those id impulses coming out without it being self-destructive. All right, so as I mentioned, dream interpretation. This was a huge part of Freud's practice, his ideas. And so I have a still here from the Dream Inception, just because it's a fun movie about dreams, although it's certainly not entirely Freudian in its interpretation of dreams. But Freud considered dreams the royal road to the unconscious. He actually, that's a quote from him, the royal road to the unconscious. He thought that this is where you could truly find out what was lurking below the surface of that iceberg. So he talked about the manifest content, and this is what you actually remember from the dream. It is what's made manifest to you, the dreamer. So whatever that strange content is, you remember, right? So like the dream I always use as an example is like the one I remember most vividly from my childhood. It was not too long after Jurassic Park came out, and I had this dream that I was being chased by a baby Tyrannosaurus Rex. And I was not scared because it was a T-Rex, weird, but because it had rabies. I don't know, man. And then I remember waking up and the blankets at the end of my bed were folded in such a way that it like could be a dinosaur, you know, to your half awake mind. So I was like kicking my blankets. That's one of my dreams I remember most vividly, right? But Freud would say that's not actually a dream about a dinosaur. That's a dream about something else. Now, one misconception a lot of people have is that Freud never came up with like a dream diary or an encyclopedia, dictionary. There's the word I'm looking for. He didn't think like this meant this for everybody. He interpreted everything in the context of that particular client's life. So he used free association to analyze the dream. And if you talked about it enough, this manifest content, what's made manifest to you, the dreamer, will get you to what Freud called the latent content. And this is what's residing beneath in potential or unexpressed form. So this is essentially the meaning of the manifest content, the latent content. So the belief here was that you can't express these thoughts in consciousness to begin with. They're too powerful. Again, these would be things like id urges, wishes, desires, passions. And so dreams and the manifest content of dreams allow you to safely discharge the tension. So things that have been repressed can come out in your dreams where it's, you know, socially appropriate. And so wishes that are activated during the day can come out at night. Now, interestingly, that last sentence is a little bit of how a lot of modern scientists interpret dreams. So most modern therapies don't put too much stock into dream interpretation, but like sort of modern psychology and modern neuroscience sort of thinks that what dreams are is a way of our brains to sort of process what we experience throughout the day. And they may even have to do with like memory consolidation. So this idea that wishes that are activated during the day come out at night kind of relates to that more modern idea. So the dream work to Freud is when your brain, your mind, transferred or translated the latent content those wishes, urges into the manifest content, the Tyrannosaurus Rex for me, right? And so it's disguised, it's compromised, there's convention, there's wish conversion, there's wish fulfillment. Freud believed that it was the ego that did this piece. Again, remember the ego's function is to kind of like figure out how to make things socially acceptable. So even in dreams, it's sort of trying to protect you. Or if we think back to his original model, the censor, right? That screen door. And there are several mechanisms by which this happened. So the first is condensation, where one dream symbol might actually stand for several different pieces of latent content, several different associations, ideas. And so again, this is why he couldn't just be like, if you see a horse, it means this. Because for him, these symbols usually meant more than one thing. Another is displacement. This is sort of a chain of association that runs sideways to where the latent content becomes completely unrecognizable in the manifest content. So for example, maybe your father is represented by a bucket, right? You didn't just make that jump. There were probably like a whole bunch of sideways things that somehow that happened. Symbolism is just disguise. The idea is like, I better keep that one to myself, right? Even from myself. And then secondary revision is a rearrangement of the seemingly incoherent elements of the dream into a form serviceable for narration. So this is why when we wake up, and again, we don't always remember all our dreams, right? But if there's one we particularly remember when we wake up, we can kind of tell it like a story. And Freud's idea was that the secondary revision that allowed us to do that. It sort of strung all these weird things together and made it have a narrative. This involves logical and temporal reorganization in obedience to the principles of non-contradiction, temporal sequence, and causality. Above all, it is instrumental dream censorship, and it may produce omissions or additions, right? So like in trying to make this narrative, some of the latent content may be sort of embellished and others may be sort of tuned out, right? So dream interpretation is what psychoanalysts did and still do in therapy. So this is done by the analyst, and it's how you get from the manifest content back down to the latent content. So a good analyst would do this based on lots of evidence, like a good lawyer. So you wouldn't just be like, again, like, oh, you dreamed about a bucket, that's about your dad, right? You would do a lot of free association with a dream, you would compile evidence, you would essentially build your case. And so Levine had a great quote, sort of a play on the old police song here. Every move you make, every cake you bake, every step you take, we'll be analyzing you. So I have a couple of videos here that I'm going to share. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. The first is going to be a portrayal of psychoanalysis in the 40s. So this is about a decade or so after Freud died. So you can sort of see how people thought of it when it was fairly new. And then I have one that's sort of like funny, trying to show elements of it, but in a comical way video that I'll show you as well here. But first we'll do the original psychoanalysis one. And this is from a documentary.
Today, many leading hospitals, such as Mount Sinai in New York, are treating human ailments from a fresh viewpoint. When, as often happens, the customary checkup reveals nothing organically wrong, the new procedure is applied.
The physical findings of our examinations are completely negative.
But doctor, I've lost 15 pounds in the past 3 months. I can't eat. I can't hold down a job.
We feel that the causes of your illness are emotional. That's why I'm referring you to our psychosomatic department. You remember the psychiatrist you saw?
Psychosomatic medicine, from the Greek, soma the body and psyche the mind, applies the combined skills of mental and physical medicine to bodily ills which are rooted wholly or partly in some disturbance of mind and emotions.
Now, tell me about your mother.
It seemed like Mom spent most of her time helping Dad with his business. I guess she didn't have much time left over for me, even when I was sick.
Were you sick very much as a child?
Quite a bit. They told me that one time when Mom went away and left me, that I had some kind of an accident. Sick for a long time. I couldn't even eat unless Mom was around.
Requiring all the psychiatrist's skill and many months of his time is the slow uncovering of the emotional conflicts which so often lie at the root of an illness.
Tell me some more about Catherine, the girl you fell in love with.
Well, things went swell for a while. It seems she gave me, I don't know.
Yes?
Well, she gave me love like I never got at home. Dad or Mom were always too busy. Cold, sort of. Catherine really thought the world of me.
Well, what happened then?
One day she told me that she was going to marry another guy, a fellow from out west.
When was that?
Oh, about a year ago.
When did your illness begin? Didn't you start to have trouble eating after that?
Yeah, I guess. Funny. I never thought of it that way.
When, by bringing the emotional conflict into the open, the doctor has helped the patient to understand his trouble, the way is clear to deal with it effectively.
After his girl had married someone else, he became actively ill, again as a means of getting a kind of maternal affection. He recognized in a burst of revelation the sickness was his way of getting the affection which he had been denied as a child. Gradually, he worked out a hardier and more realistic attitude as he realized these things for himself and became able to seek affection in a normal way. He has found another girl he can care for and is now working again.
Contributing to psychosomatic medicine are the much-debated theories of psychoanalysis. Today, organizations of specialists in mental medicine, like the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, have helped to gain general medical acceptance for such doctrines, considered a radical departure when first advanced by Dr. Sigmund Freud of Vienna some 50 years ago. Here are offered both lectures on psychoanalysis for laymen and courses of study for physicians in the origin and treatment of mental troubles.
Distressing experiences in childhood may set up patterns which in later life will produce mental conflicts. Such conflicts lead to the same feeling of insecurity which was felt as a child. When such conflicts paralyze the individual, preventing him from acting freely, he is said to have a neurosis. Let us see how a neurosis develops. Here is a baby, happy in its mother's love. It feels secure even when with strangers, as you see. Now, note the contrast. This is the same child after it had been deprived of its mother for 3 months. As you see, its expression is mask-like, similar to that of an adult suffering from depression. Its emotional reaction may have been permanently impaired by this early experience of frustration, and a serious conflict may develop on this basis, which could affect its whole adult life.
One major contribution of psychoanalysis to medicine is evidence that unsatisfactory childhood relationships may cause repercussions years later. Today, America's psychiatrists have long waiting lists of such maladjusted people.
But why do I keep getting so depressed, Doctor? That's what I can't figure out.
Let's go over what you've already told me. You're in good physical shape, according to your physician who sent you to me. You say yourself you have no financial or domestic worries, so the causes of your depression must lie elsewhere.
Well, there's got to be some reason why I go through all this mental misery, Doctor.
In order to find out, I suggest we undertake a month or so of exploratory analysis.
From the beginning, in order that the patient under analysis may feel free of constraint, he is placed on a couch and urged to let his mind roam freely. For every slightest thought or random memory may offer some clue to the deeply rooted causes of his illness.
That's odd. I had a sudden glimpse of the time when I was a kid and got stung in the toe by a bee. Oh, my brother laughed at me. But that's beside the point, isn't it?
Psychoanalysis is a long and difficult process of reconstructing from fragmentary recollections a picture giving the patient a correct insight into the forces at work within him and enabling him to deal with his problems realistically.
I had a talk with my brother today. He's in trouble again. No use trying to help him. It's like pouring water down a bottomless well. I hate my brother. Loathe him. Despise him. For 40 years I've been hating him. Well, I never came out and said so before. I always think of him sitting on Mama's lap. She loved him. She just tolerated me. You see what it does to me? Fine way for a man in my position to act, isn't it?
When we are little and get all caught up in violent, opposing feelings, we have to let off steam by crying. Here you are, caught between jealousy, hatred, and yearning, all buried inside. You couldn't kill your brother, though you wanted to. You couldn't take his place with your mother. Storms of rage and fear have been building up in you from that day to this.
It's funny. I feel a little better now.
Dr. Myers, I can't hear you.
Thank you. I was muted. I appreciate you telling me. So yes, obviously acted, right? A little dramatically. But that is sort of what analysts would do. So they would sit back, let the client associate, make these connections, and then they would offer interpretation. So like I said, I have a funnier one that we'll watch now. That one was pretty, serious. This one is totally acted, really goofy, but hopefully you'll enjoy it.
This sometimes humorous reenactment of a psychoanalytic therapy session based on an actual case effectively shows the principles of free association, transference, resistance, and dream interpretation in action.
I really don't have much to talk about today. Nothing much has happened in the last 24 hours. Work today was boring, so I really don't have much of interest to talk about.
Just real quick, why he's like, I don't have much to talk about. Work today was boring. True psychoanalysis, you would meet with your therapist for 4 to 5 times a week for an hour each time. So he's seen her yesterday.
When you left here yesterday, you seemed kind of anxious about a date you had last night.
Oh, yes. I don't know why I forgot about that. The whole reason I came to analysis was to figure out what goes wrong every time I start dating a woman. Anyway, the date last night was pretty much a bust. I felt awkward and inept. I took her to a movie, but I couldn't enjoy the movie because the whole time I was wondering about whether or not she found me interesting. She didn't say anything to me, so I kept thinking that she didn't want to have anything to do with me. Anyway, an hour into the movie, she asked if we could go because she was feeling sick. So I took her home. I felt like a complete failure. Oh, that reminds me of a dream I had last night. I was sitting in a movie theater, but for some reason it was all lit up instead of dark. The name of the film was Crimes of the Heart, which I haven't actually seen in real life. A woman sitting behind me was giggling, so I turned around and looked at her. She kind of flirted with me, so I turned back immediately. Then I noticed a man sitting about 4 or 5 seats away from me in my row. And he looked like a real slob and was incredibly obnoxious. I noticed he was eating buttered popcorn in a messy, disgusting manner. I handed him a napkin. I don't know where I got a napkin from. But anyway, the man completely ignored me and just kept on eating. Then he noticed the woman sitting behind me, and they began to exchange flirtatious glances with each other. Finally, the man got up out of his seat and went and sat next to the woman behind me. They were giggling and carrying on and made it hard for me to hear the movie. Then an usher came up and told me that I was making too much noise and I should leave. I explained to him that it was the couple sitting behind me that was making all the noise, not me. But he didn't seem to believe me. He just kept telling me to leave. I argued with him, but he got increasingly threatening. It looked like he was going to bash me one any minute. Then I woke up.
As you think about the dream, what comes to mind?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is pretty obvious, I guess. I think about the movie that I went to last night. In both situations, I felt pretty uncomfortable. But my date really looked nothing like the woman in the dream. I can't really say the woman in the dream reminded me of anybody. I know she was wearing glasses. Oh, I just remembered something. She was holding a white rose in her hands. I know that sounds pretty bizarre to be sitting in a fully lit movie theater carrying a white rose.
Does the white rose bring anything particular to mind?
Oh, of course. The woman I took out last night was named Rose. But like I said, she really looked nothing like the woman in the dream. Besides, the woman in the dream was sitting behind me. Wait a minute, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say that you are sitting behind me, and therefore the woman in the dream must represent you. I really don't think so, though, because like I said, she really looked nothing like you. Besides, you don't wear glasses.
Kind of sillily acted, gives you a perspective on what like dream interpretation might look like, and what something like transference, countertransference might look like, right? Like, because the therapist always sits behind him, he might sort of have forgotten what she looked like, right? And so she was probably going to have to process that with him. So I'm going to go ahead and share our PowerPoint for our last few minutes here, because we just have one slide left. So there are obviously many criticisms of Freud. You've heard me mention several of them throughout our lecture. So Freud's theories were very scandalous at the time in the Victorian era, when people didn't talk about sex. So that, again, was one of the first issues that really arose for him. In addition, this is a time that people were starting to think more about the soul, and freedom of the soul, civil rights. And what Freud's suggesting, if you really think about it, in terms of, you know, the id controlling you, all these unconscious forces being out of your control, he seems to suggest we don't have free will, right? Everything's governed by these unconscious forces. So, you know, people didn't necessarily like that either. Another issue with Freud's theory is complexity. If you remember back to, you know, our second day of class, we talked about wanting parsimony in theories, keeping it simple. Clearly Freud didn't do that, right? He doesn't have the simplest explanation for things. His ideas are extremely complex. You know, but again, in psychology, is that something we actually want for our theories? Because humans are complex, right? The case study method is a big criticism. His research is all single case studies. He couldn't publish all the details because of confidentiality. And there's no statistics, right? There's no way to generalize or compare it to other cases. Many of his definitions of his terms were vague. And again, in science, we usually want operational definitions that are really clear to us. We want to define things based on operations and procedures with which it can be identified and measured. Yeah, something like the id, right? And again, he just called it the it. Sort of hard to operationally define that, right? And that relates to, honestly, the biggest issue that most modern psychologists have, which is untestability. You really can't confirm or disconfirm his theories. You really can't test them at all because you can't, like, come up with a way to test them. And in fact, one of the things you'll read for one of our discussions next week is a psychoanalyst arguing whether or not psychoanalysts should even try to do research and try to test things. Sexism is something I kind of hinted at through this. So Freud considered males the norms. So for example, like his idea of like, the women kind of go through the Oedipal complex, but not really, so they never develop a super ego, so they can never be fully formed people. He also thought the only way for women to get over penis envy was to give birth to a male child. Right? So super sexist, obviously. He just saw females as aberrations from male models. And he's not alone in this. Medicine at the time really looked at women this way. But sometimes we still do look at women this way in studies, which is obviously very problematic. And then one of his biggest issues, as I've mentioned before, is he rarely worked with kids, but most of his theories are based on conflicts in childhood, right? So there's a retrospective bias. He's basing all his ideas on what patients told him about their past. I don't know about you all, but I can't really remember exactly the way things were when I was 5 and supposedly going through the Oedipal complex, right? And in fact, modern research about development of cognitive abilities shows that like long-term memory in the way we think of it as adults doesn't really form until we're 3 or 4, right? So the idea that people could remember what happened to them when they were infants, problematic. And obviously more than that, his own ideas from his past clearly influenced these theories. Some would argue unduly, although as we go through other therapists, you'll see that most of them, their personal experiences also influenced them. But he was still extremely influential. Again, that's why we give him so much time, because we need to have context for every time from here on forward when I say, well, this person was in conflict with Freud for this, or they did this in reaction to Freud, right? And he tried to explain everything. Development, personality, abnormality, right? Everything. He actually even had a theory of neurons based on the ego and the superego. So he was really trying to explain everything about the human mind and the human brain. And he was in some ways limited by the technology of his time. Like, they didn't have brain scans then, so he had to make a lot of assumptions. And again, he's the first one talking to people without hypnotizing them first. So everything was really novel at that time. Alrighty. So that is the end of our lecture about Freud. Like I said, you all are going to do a reading about Freud for Monday, and then I'll also have a little case study that you'll read in class very short, like a page front and back, that will base some of our discussions on as well. So I'll do my normal sticking around a couple minutes in case anyone has questions. If not, everybody have a good weekend. Be safe. Wear your masks. I actually just saw the governor and his wife now have COVID, so yeah. Be safe. Take care of yourselves. See you Monday.
Bye. Have a good day.
You do.
Question, but it's not about class. It's about advising.
Sure.
I was looking at my academic evaluation, and what is cross-registration? It says here on my psychology portion of the degree that I have to take psychology 202, and that's called cross-registration. I don't know what that means.
So I think what it is there's probably someone who's taking it through cross-registration right now somewhere else. Actually, what is the term we're giving us? Okay, so Dr. Martorell is just like finalizing it now. I think we're calling it critical thinking in psychology.
Okay, is that going to be available in the spring, or?
Yeah, we'll be offering that in the spring for the first time.
Okay, perfect.
Awesome. Yeah, and the schedule end of October, I think.
Okay, perfect. Have a nice weekend.
You too.
Thank you.
Dr. Myers,